Welcome everyone to another episode of the ChrisRodMax Show. Every week we discuss about what's happening in AI. We are exploring what's going on in this space that's ever changing, and we give you the insights and also discussions with the movers and shakers in the space. And as it is every week, we have today a fantastic guest. We're today with Meryem Arik, who is the CEO and co-founder of Doubleword AI, former Titan ML. And it's amazing to have you here, Meryem. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, guys.
Before we get started, so here I'm curious, Meryem, on just so here your background, right? So where if we think about AI, it seems to be a little like male dominated. It seems like here the classic tech bro and so on, but you're not a tech bro. So how is it that you end up in this space?
So me and actually both my co-founders originally come from a physics background. And the pipeline from physics to AI is actually relatively strong. There's, I guess, like similar ways of thinking about the world, which are relevant when you're doing physics research that kind of move on into AI as well. Both my co-founders went and did their PhDs and postdocs in theoretical physics. I actually didn't. Instead, I went into the city and I became a banker, essentially. So I went from physics to banking. And we came together at a time when I think we had played with like GPT-2 models, and maybe the early GPT-3 models had just come out. And we just kind of collectively were really, really excited by how good we thought those models were at the time. Looking back on it, they were really, really terrible. But the idea that we could have these models produce things that sounded like coherent, for example, Shakespeare, just felt like really, really impressive and really huge. And so we were all kind of interested in the advancements that were happening in AI and started to think about, well, if AI is going to continue on the trajectory that we thought it was with GPT-2 and GPT-3, the T5 models as well, then what kind of infrastructure would we need to build to be able to account for that kind of rise? And our thesis back then and our thesis now is the thing that we would need to build is inference infrastructure, which actually at the time was a little bit counterintuitive. Everyone thought that training and training costs were the real bottleneck in AI because they were very, very expensive. But our thesis was if these models keep getting as good as they're getting and keep this rate of improvement, then people are going to be using them so much that inference is going to be that real bottleneck. And so, that's kind of how the story emerged. We knew each other from our physics backgrounds. I went off into the city. They did their PhDs and postdocs, and we came together because we had this mutual interest in AI, and we've kind of married our backgrounds as well a little bit. We now sell to highly regulated institutions, just like where my background came from, and we use state-of-the-art techniques that came from their physics days as well. So it all kind of marry together pretty nicely.
Yes, and you were mentioning here how these first models, they now looking so in hindsight, they look so basic, so primitive, right? I also remember back then how fascinating it was to say, "Oh, talk to me like a pirate," and then you would say, "Oh, wow, it's like a pirate." And now, yeah, all that feels so trivial. And you're talking here about inference, and I often it's like a term that so on one side not everyone understands, but also depending on your background might mean different things, right? So if you have like more like so this is background or machine learning or whatever it is. And from what you're describing, basically, Doubleword is 100% focused on AI inference. So maybe you can give us like a deep dive. First, what is inference, and then how is Doubleword helping here?
Sure. So you can think of inference as opposed to the training step. So maybe I'll start with explaining what training is, and then go on to explain what inference is. So and they're not. The line isn't always necessarily this clear, but this might be helpful. So the training step is essentially when you take a model architecture or base weight and you train it with a bunch of data. So maybe the whole internet or maybe some more specialized data. And you use that to update the model and update its intelligence until you get this like final form model. And this final form model is reasonably intelligent. Maybe it's something like a GPT-4o, right, where it's seen a huge amount of data and information, and it's updated that information kind of in its model brain, for example. Now, the process of inference is distinct somewhat to the process of training, where you're not kind of teaching it new things anymore. You're actually getting it to do the things. So maybe a way you could think about it is the difference between a student who is in school all year learning, and then they actually go and apply that knowledge, maybe in a test, for example. And this process of inference, they're actually going and generating the words, predictions, answers based on essentially all of the information that it's seen before. And so when you're using ChatGPT and just talking to it normally, that's a process of inference. It's a process of you're asking it questions and it's responding with the best of its ability, given everything that it kind of knows or perceives it knows. And so what do we do at Doubleword? So every time that you speak to ChatGPT or other AI models like a Anthropic AI API or anything like that, you're going through a process of inference. And the process of inference is actually infrastructurally very difficult to do properly. So OpenAI and Anthropic have teams of dozens and dozens of people dedicated to figuring out how to inference these models efficiently and scalably. And so when you're using these API providers like Anthropic, like OpenAI, etc., you're taking for granted all of their AI infrastructure and their inference infrastructure. It's deployed on their GPUs, it's their model, their hosting and doing all of the infrastructure behind it. Now, for a lot of clients, especially regulated industries and also people that want to deploy at scale, they don't want to use these API provided hosted models. And we think this is going to be an increasing trend over the next couple of years. They instead want to host these models in their own private environment. So they have complete control of it. They have complete control of the scalability, the IP, all of those things. And when they do that process of self-hosting, they suddenly need to take on all of the kind of difficulty of self-hosting. They need to now recreate what that team of a couple dozen people in OpenAI did within their own organization. And essentially what we do is we make that process of self-hosting much easier. So we provide all of the software layer that you need to self-host, which people then, deploy their models into that infrastructure. So yeah, inference essentially is the process of where AI models actually become useful. You use them in your actual life. And what we do at Doubleword is we make inference when it's privately hosted and self-hosted much easier.
Wow, that was so here a comprehensive deep dive, and I'm sure that now for those who are not in the space, they might get a better understanding on so what's the difference between training a model and then just querying it, using it through inference. And Max, you're in this space, you're like in here a finance person, right? So here is something where definitely it's something like Doubleword. So it's a technology that you've been seeing, that you're facing, problems that you're having. Your take.
Well, what gave it away? I'm a finance person. Is it a shirt? But I guess first off, thank you for the question. I think we're definitely seeing more of that. I think Meryem is absolutely right. We're seeing way more models being hosted internally within regulated industry. There are two reasons to that, right? Number one is just having more control over the infrastructure itself, so that it become more resilient for whatever use cases that you want. Number two, I also seeing increasingly to make some of these models become very useful for specific use cases. A lot of larger organizations are using data internally, data that they cannot and will not share outside of their own premises, which then, the combination of, hosting models, training those models with, our own, I would say data, and eventually, inference, even the inferences itself kind of give you a sense of what are things that you're asking for. You will never want any of that to leak out of the organization. So I totally agree with Meryem, and I'm seeing actually way more of that than you think. Like the initial stuff that you give it to your employees to play with, sure, but when it becomes mission critical, where information become quite important, I think that really scales up. I can only speak for a lot of the, I would say, banks that I've met and spoken to, that seems to be the case.
Yes, yeah, it is. But here, what I was thinking also about that. So in these cases, we're talking about situations where it is, let's say, highly regulated industries, and also that is like difficult and so on. But Miriam, is there a case for basically, let's say, your run-of-the-mill company, large organization, enterprise, to say, hey, I want to have my own models hosted in my infrastructure? Or is it something where it only makes sense if, for example, I'm here like a large bank and I say, hey, there is all these security and privacy concerns that I need to address?
No, there definitely is a case, and Max touched on one of the cases. So I would say there's broadly two reasons why a typical enterprise would want to self-host. Now, the first one is a question of scale and scalability. So these API provided hosted models actually are not super scalable, and people run into issues all of the time with hitting rate limits, having high latency, kind of poor throughput, all of these things. And so if you're actually deploying these models at scale, it's firstly better performance and also cheaper, typically, if you self-host it properly. So that's one reason if you're deploying these models at scale. A second reason, which Max touched on, is every single company has proprietary information, proprietary knowledge, domain-specific knowledge that isn't necessarily ingested into the model when it's first trained. Because every institution will have a bunch of knowledge that they're never going to share with the outside world, even if they're not highly regulated. And so what you can do is go through this process of fine-tuning or specialization, where you take these base models that have really good generic knowledge and fine-tune it and specialize it on your particular domain, maybe for your particular task. And this applies to pretty much any organization that might have this kind of information. And when you do that process of fine-tuning, specialization, you almost always self-host it because that's really your IP. So they're kind of the two main reasons. There's also a third reason, which is this idea of sovereignty is not one that's reserved just for the highly regulated institutions. So if you are actually deploying AI with anger and really using it to transform your business, within the next couple of years, you will have a huge number of processes internally that are relying on that AI working. Maybe you've completely changed the workflows that your folks do. And so if you have that kind of situation where you really bet your business on AI working, it's just like obvious that you would need that in your control, and you would need to be able to trust that that infrastructure is always going to be up, the model's always going to be available, all of those kinds of things. So I guess scalability is one. If you need custom or fine-tune models, that's another. And then also this idea of AI sovereignty. If AI is really important to your business, you need to be able to control it.
Super interesting, Meryem. Maybe a question more from a non-technical perspective. Obviously, your target audience are B2B enterprises that want to deploy your solution. What are some of the most asked questions these stakeholders ask you, and what are some of your answers to those questions?
It's a great question. So I think a lot of people, our sales cycle is very consultative. And part of the reason for that is typically when we go in to sell to a client, we're not replacing an existing solution they have for self-hosting necessarily. Maybe they're already, they've been using AI, but using hosted forms of AI just on a limited number of use cases. Or maybe they've just not been able to use any AI at all because maybe they're on premise or something like that. And so within the sales cycle, there's a big process of telling people and informing people and educating people in what's actually involved when you're self-hosting. And it's not just a VLM server, and it's not just an Llama server. There's like a lot of infrastructure you need to build around that to actually build a scalable performance solution. And so we've spent a lot of the early part of this year kind of mapping out exactly what does an ideal self-hosted infrastructure look like. We have resources that I think are freely available on exactly what the space of self-hosted looks like. What are the things you actually need? And the sales cycle is really involved in that. So, for example, things that people don't think about: logging and monitoring and alerting at the infrastructure layer, at the model layer, at the application layer. You need various forms of user permissioning. You need, for example, like auto scaling and very like smart forms of request prioritization. And these are things that you would only think about if you've actually done it at scale. That's a slightly different conversation that we have when it's clients that have been self-hosting internally and they've kind of learned that along the way. But for a lot of clients, they're buying our kind of solution when they're first trying out self-hosting as a thing.
So what I'm also hearing here is that basically your ideal audience is an audience or companies that have already started self-hosting, have run into some problems. And I think that's really where your service and your solution can very much help. Because if you've done it or you're doing it for the first time or considering, how to approach AI in a very secure manner, then obviously there's so much more hand holding and education you would have to do from your perspective.
I think there's nothing wrong with hand holding in education. If you think the client's going to be a good long-term customer. I love it when I speak to teams who have been self-hosting for the last 2 years and you get to talk about the real challenges and meats under the hood. But it's also equally as satisfying when you're working with customers who've just been paralyzed for the last 2 years because they've not been able to do AI on the data they want to because of this problem. And so we're happy doing hand-holding a more consultative sale at the beginning if we think we're really unlocking something and unlocking value for them. So for the key, our ideal customer is people that get value from self-hosting in the long term.
Here, what was coming to mind was that we're now in the year 3 of the ChatGPT revolution, if we can call it like that. And in some ways, the market has matured. In others, it seems we have not really advanced, and there's more or less the same questions that there were 3 years ago. And I wonder here, Meryem, what would you say that so your buyers already understand, and which are the things do you still continue repeating yourself over and over again until you will say, hey, this should be by now understood?
It's a great question, and 3 years actually is really early, I guess, in a technological revolution and cycle. I think the thing that is most striking to me is not the things necessarily that still haven't been understood, but the difference in understanding with different institutions and the difference in maturity is really, really stark. So you have some businesses who essentially maybe started their Gen AI efforts before ChatGPT came out. They're really mature. They have dozens of use cases. They probably even have agent use cases in production. And their level of maturity and understanding is kind of at really, really one end. And then you have a huge number of institutions and companies who, for whatever reason, maybe have got to a POC or a pilot, or maybe haven't been able to do anything, or maybe, they just have co-pilot licenses. And so their understanding is very, very, very different. There's a phrase in Silicon Valley, which is the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I'm really, really seeing that with kind of enterprise AI. There's a lot of the techniques that all of these institutions are going to need to really transform their businesses are already here. It's just a big education cycle and process.
Cool. I think that's super interesting. I think the other thing that I've been thinking about is, by installing all this infrastructure, clearly a lot of all these large organizations have some sort of use cases in mind. And one of the things that I've been trying to find is categorization of some of these use cases, right? Is it just more of, imprinting, or are you seeing more agentic use cases coming up? I guess let's just get your thoughts on this, right? Obviously, you speak to quite a lot of companies and corporates out there. It's just something that I'm aware that there are some organizations, exactly to your point, that are really on one edge where they really push for agentic use cases, but then there are also some that are just starting the journey. So what's the split there? How are you seeing the market here? And I guess then the next question would be, how would that move on? Because people are obviously building and spending money as they go.
I think almost every business has aspirations for agentic AI, because that's really where they see the future of this going, where there's huge numbers of kind of workflows that people do every day that AI would be able to massively assist them with, and they can do more interesting things. So I think all of them see the potential of the agentic stuff. And so when they're talking about conversations and talking about use cases, it's definitely one that they're we want to make sure our infrastructure is agent ready, right? It'll be able to handle the number of tokens that agents need. It'll be able to handle the MCP servers and all of those things. So it's definitely a conversation and a topic. However, it's very rarely the first, second, third, or even 10th use case. And so I think a mistake potentially is to think of an agent use case as something really distinct and separate for other AI use cases, when often I think they're just kind of a natural building on top. And so a way you can think about RAG is you're giving a base LLM a tool, right? And you're giving it the tool of being able to search. And maybe then your next step is you have a RAG where it can search between 5 different vector stores, and maybe that's like a slightly more agentic system. And typically what we see is not people make this leap from non-agentic to agentic, but actually they make this like gradual increase in complexity from base models to base models plus RAG to RAG plus a couple tools, and then you kind of build up to the agentic system, which also along the way allows you to gain that institutional knowledge of what actually is involved in building an agent, because they're scary and risky things, and also allows you to mitigate that risk along the way and understand that risk along the way, because you're not going from 0 to 100, you're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. And so that's the approach that I've seen people as them making that agentic journey.
Yeah, it's very much an evolution rather than revolution, right? You kind of just have to try and try until you get there. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I've been seeing, just to I guess add to that point, is pretty much that as well. Like there will be an aspiration from the top on what they want to achieve, but then on the ground, when they actually implement it, they kind of need to show progress, right? Like, okay, so this is our first thing that we can do, and then next thing is we're going to train the open source model with internal data that is available to everyone. Then next thing is let's allow everyone to at least have a sense of what they can build from a agentic workflow perspective, and then we'll go from there. That's interesting.
Yeah, because I think when you talk about we need to actually show things, there's like a huge amount of pressure from top down to show that you're doing something with AI. In fact, like I can't think of like a real parallel of when that's happened in the past. And so even if you're just thinking about like how do you communicate value to the higher ups, the way to do that is not to say we're going to sit in this room for 2 years and try and build an agent that's going to revolutionize our business. The thing that you're going to do is get those low-hanging fruits and get those wins in order to be able to show that we're actually making progress with AI. So that's kind of more the approach that I see, exactly as you say.
And Meryem, so you were saying that agentic AI is something that's like aspirational, but then it's like challenging and it takes a while to get there and so on. Is there like some sort of like roadmap or maybe like a timeline that you've seen with companies on how do they get started when they start self-hosting? What are the first use cases and how are they maturing all the way, let's say, to this elusive agentic AI in the enterprise?
My hope is that the use cases that they pick when self-hosting are not dramatically different to the use cases they would pick when using like an API provided model like OpenAI, with a couple caveats. And so typically our customers will have some kind of use case matrix of things that they want to build. RAG is like the super popular kind of first step, and then kind of more complex forms of RAG built into workflows tends to be that next step, and then you move on to agents, etc. And if we're doing our job right, the experience of using APIs that are self-hosted should just be just as easy and just high quality as using like an OpenAI hosted model, with a couple caveats. And the caveats are that it should actually unlock more use cases and should be better. And kind of the 3 branches of use cases that I think it can unlock are, number 1, if you have use cases that we think would be deployed at mass scale, then I think it can unlock those use cases and maybe they can move up the prioritization matrix. Secondly, if you have, as Max was saying, like domain-specific applications that you're not able to get the quality you need with these closed source models, then that can move up the prioritization scale. And thirdly, if there's some use cases that you're just not allowed to do for whatever cyber and data regulation reasons, to send to a third party, but you can do in-house, that also moves up the prioritization scale. And so when we have our clients with these list of use cases, when I talk about the prioritization scale, what I mean is they should have a matrix, and the matrix is on one hand level of impact and on the other hand level of technical feasibility. And the level of impact should stay the same, but with self-hosting, we should be able to make some things more technically feasible, either making it more scalable, making it more kind of customizable, or allowing them to achieve use cases that otherwise would not have been allowed.
And Doubleword is basically infrastructure. And what I wonder here, Meryem, is, and then it's like a bit abstract for everyone. How do you go about making more tangible for potential customers, but also when you're demoing and so on? So it is, let's say, like we're very often used to, let's say, like SaaS, and in SaaS there are like buttons and interfaces and shiny things and so on. So it becomes much more tangible. But in your case, you come here with something that is really like on a code level and it's much more harder to communicate. So what is it that you show? How do you make it much more approachable?
And maybe Rod, to add to your question, I think the challenge startups have that sell B2B is usually that there are users, there are decision makers, and then maybe there's a purchase department of some sorts. And usually it takes quite, maybe not so much convincing or for the dev team or the tech team. But then again, those are not necessarily the ones that actually have the decision power. So I think, maybe also for the sake of our audience, in simple terms, if you had to like explain it to a 5-year-old or make it more tangible, I think that's really probably very valuable for the audience.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it's definitely something that as a company we struggled with for a while, because like at the time our infrastructure was essentially like code, right? And you interacted with it through the command line. We've made some changes since earlier this year where we've put a management console and a front end onto all of the work that we did. So we spent about a month or two essentially building an intuitive UI on top of our product. We didn't actually change the product at all. We didn't add new features in that and the time it took us to build that. But the quality of conversation completely changed because it went from being like a pure dev tool that only, developers who read the documentation could understand to it being something that everyone in the business could understand because they could see, oh, here is how I go and deploy my model. And here is how it's scaling up and down. And here is how I'm looking at my kind of logging and monitoring and making sure I've got auditability and traceability. And so like the process of just essentially putting buttons on the thing that we had for a while really, really changed the quality of conversation that we were able to have. And now with that realization, we're investing far more time in essentially this user-facing features that we can spend the effort and take the effort to think about how we want to visually represent them to the user in line with the value that we think they're bringing. So yeah, infrastructure is really hard, kind of broadly to sell, exactly because that reason you're saying. And for us, when we essentially put management consoles in front of it and allowed people to interact with it in that way, it completely changed the quality of conversation there.
And Meryem, do you think it would be possible to demo it or show something?
Yeah, it actually exists. It's a real thing. And so in spirit, it looks very similar to potentially things that you might have seen like Bedrock or Vertex or, a bunch of these deployment platforms where you can go to what we called our approved model hub. So these are the models that are approved by your particular organization. We don't let you necessarily put in any model that you want. And we have these model cards, which are kind of a familiar interface for people. So we can say, for example, I want to go and deploy this llama model. I say I want to deploy it. I can enter in various details, decide which cluster I'm going to deploy it on. So this is really important for our clients because very rarely do they have a single cluster they want everything deployed to. They probably have different regions with different access controls. They probably have different on-prem servers, et cetera, et cetera. So I can say I want to deploy it, let's say, on my GKE or my on-prem. So let's say I want to deploy my on-prem. We have this notion of scaling up and down. And the reason for this is if your traffic that you get to your model often spikes up and down. And so we want our model to be able to scale up and down in line with that. So maybe I want to give my model access to 4 GPUs instead of just statically on 1. We can then also allow it to scale to 0 as well. So what that allows it to do is say, if I'm not getting any requests for, let's say, 10 minutes, I can scale down to just a small controller node and essentially reduce my compute cost to 0. So in theory, we should be scaling the GPU usage based on the request that we're going to have. We can also say whether we want to deploy with fine-tuned models or deploy with LoRa, and then we can essentially just go and deploy. Now, this is different to if you were building without a platform like ours, where it would take you at least a couple of days to set up all of this kind of infrastructure every single time you're doing it. Now, if I go to models that I've got already deployed, I can say I want to look at this particular model. I have access to all of the things I need, like the metrics, activities, logs. I can interact with the API, etc., etc. And all of this is logged and monitored, and I can look at very common analytics over here as well. So this is just kind of it doesn't have all of our features yet on kind of this interface, but it has essentially, it explains the concept really nicely of we can go and provide our engineers with approved models that as an organization we approve of. In this case, I'm logged in as an admin, so I can see all of the models and I can add new models, etc. It takes me just one click to deploy those models into my deployments, which allows me to test models really, really quickly. And when it goes to production, I don't need to do anything extra. It just kind of sits there. It allows me to do management of different clusters, etc. And then do the like logging and monitoring and analytics of all of that. So that's kind of at a high level what it looks like. And I mean, hopefully it's definitely easier for me to explain what we do than it was like a year ago when I was just I didn't have anything visual to show. I was just trying to explain code.
Definitely. I think gives me at least a much better understanding of what you guys are building. And I'm sure also for the audience that's looking or that's currently listening through the YouTube channel.
Here, when you were mentioning that on one side, the quality of conversation change, but also we see that basically AI is everywhere these days, right? It's like every company needs it, and then pretty much every function and so on. And given that, so now we can have, for example, this type of demos that are so much more tangible. Has it changed your persona, or now which type of profiles and functions are especially excited when they hear what Doubleword is offering? Do you have already like identified, hey, if we focus on like this profile in this department, in this type of industry, that's where we have here maybe like a sweet spot?
Yeah, I think it has changed the profile somewhat to actually be a little bit more of a senior profile within infrastructure or the office of the CDO, because they see the process of self-hosting as a really strategically important strategically important infrastructure that they need to be able to kind of control and be able to do. And so our persona over the last couple of years has really moved from being more dev focused to being a little bit more kind of senior as it is now, and like a cell that we do slightly higher up the organization.
And just to follow up on that, what is the, I guess, most surprising thing that you learn in the process? I think what I'm having, well, I guess the question really comes from, the fact that you might have started with some hypothesis, but it's no longer the case based on what you've discovered. Just interested to hear what's the most surprising thing that you have, I guess, discovered throughout the process.
I think the thing that technological change actually doesn't really necessarily surprise me, and there's always going to be changes in tech and what's available and like how you need to position yourself in the market, and so all of that is quite unsurprising. And well, it's surprising, but you just kind of go with it. I think what I've been really pleasantly surprised by over the last couple of years is how quickly the adoption curve feels like it's come. Even though we say it's been 3 years and actually a lot of businesses haven't done things. Given the rate of adoption pre-ChatGPT, it's really moved very, very quickly. Enterprise risk appetite for trying new technologies and trying to build new applications and change the way their businesses work has also evolved with that. So I think it's less for technological change and more, I've been really pleasantly surprised by the ambition of enterprises as we enter this kind of AI era.
And maybe piggybacking on Max's question, Meryem, how do you stay on top of everything that's going on in the AI world?
Oh my God, it's an impossible battle, isn't it? I think I learn a huge amount through osmosis because I am in the space all day, every day. I read a lot about kind of news that's going on various platforms. I think actually LinkedIn, although it gets a bad rap, I think is quite good at disseminating relevant AI information fairly quickly with relevant sources. And from a academic and scientific point of view and staying on top of that, my team and my co-founders are really instrumental there. So they're the ones scouring every single new paper. And every week or every couple of weeks, we do like reading groups where we talk about the latest research that's come out that we think is really interesting and impactful for us. So I think I used to put a lot more pressure on myself to really try and stay on top of every single piece of news. I've now realized that I built enough of an ecosystem around me that I actually, through just kind of reading for enjoyment, reading blogs for enjoyment, those kinds of things, and through kind of my existing networks, etc., I tend to pick up new AI news pretty quickly. So I put slightly less pressure on myself, but I think it works. How do you guys do it? I mean, it feels like, especially Rod, when new stuff comes out, like you're always on top of it. Where are the sources?
I think that it's so a little bit on one side. So you're saying maybe like one develops a little bit like a feeling of what's going on and so on. So in the end, most of the time things do not happen in the abstract, but rather they're like the successive development of things that are going on. So you have a feeling of, oh, maybe like this is so a little bit that might happen, right? And then you see it and say, oh, actually what's right. And then but you already have like a preconceived notion of what's a little bit about. So you have already a bit of a formal opinion around that. But what I want to say was that, of course, for those who do not have that form ecosystem, our show, the ChrisRodMax Show, is the place for them to be informed, right? And with that in mind, so here, Meryem, is there anything that has surprised you lately? Is there anything where you said, hey, this is something that maybe like people should be aware of, or maybe so other things that caught you by surprise? What has happened in the space recently where you say people should know more about that?
Actually, yes, there was one last week, which was about OpenAI's data retention policy. And so OpenAI is in this kind of long-term lawsuit with the New York Times, I believe. And the lawsuit is about whether OpenAI trained on copyrighted material produced by the New York Times, and the New York Times is suing them for copyright infringement. And as part of that lawsuit, OpenAI has been required to essentially maintain all of the data and all of the logs that is produced by the models that are kind of being accused of being trained on copyright infringement, because I think the claim is something like all of the outputs of the model are potential evidence that could be used in the trial. And so not only does that include just like normal ChatGPT conversations that you have maybe on the free version, but it includes it if you're on the paid version. If you have actively deleted a chat, they will now have to retain that. If you have it on a temporary chat mode, they still have to retain that as well. Even some of the API responses as well that businesses are building on, all this information has to be retained. And what's interesting is this kind of makes every single output of ChatGPT and just like the OpenAI models legally discoverable, which really like changes the landscape of how we think about the who the data belongs to and kind of like the outputs of these models. And so OpenAI, I think, has kind of objected to this, but they have a blog on their website of what this actually means and what will be impacted, et cetera, et cetera. But something like that, for example, is a hugely impactful thing, which actually goes against, I think, a lot of people's understandings of what GDPR would require if they're having to kind of retain deleted chats as well. So that's something that caught my eye that really surprised me and is like a really concrete way that the copyright infringement claims are actually impacting users' data privacy and experience there.
Yes, there's so much to say about that. Recently, there was also this. So case is basically, so Disney is taking Midjourney to trial, right? So for like copyright infringement, because they say, oh, look at Midjourney, the feed, you can see it's everything Star Wars and Disney characters and so on, and this is our property. And I'm fascinated by what would be the outcome of that. And along those lines, Meryem, so I like this, we spent some time discussing about the impact and repercussions of AI in the workplace. So for example, I was reading the other day this post by Peter Gostev, so who you know and so on, so he's always there, also very active, where he was saying that text generated by AI is not necessarily a good thing. So where we should not be using here a model to generate our emails, but rather maybe improve like the 2-3% more. And my counter argument was because he was saying, oh, look at these top bloggers and so on. None of them use LLMs. It's all written by themselves. And I was saying, yes, but this is a little bit like Michelin star quality, right? So, and let's say like LLMs are like McDonald's. So when I go to McDonald's, I'm not expecting Michelin star quality. I just expect consistency. And what I feel with AI generated text in enterprise, it is that at least now things are much more structured, things are much clearer. Yes, I can see this was generated by ChatGPT, it's very obvious. But before, what would happen is people would just struggle expressing themselves. Maybe some formulations come as passive aggressive, there'll be friction and so on. So I see this as a positive thing. What's your take on that? So should we be using ChatGPT as like a filter always before sending out an email, or maybe just reserve it for minor changes?
It's a great question. I think the question that, or the thing that I would say is that regardless of whether it's created or just edited or minor tweaked by AI, or you wrote it all yourself, I don't mind as much, as opposed to the fact that you need to stand behind everything that you have sent or that you have created. And so even if it's 100% AI generated, that's still the responsibility of the person that sent it. And like that kind of accountability is the thing that I care more about than exactly what percentage was AI generated versus human generated. I care more about the fact that there's a human standing behind it, that they have said, yes, I agree with all of this. This is my position. And this is kind of the quality of work that I'm happy to deliver. And so I think different people have different approaches as to the ways they like to use AI. Some people just like to use it for brainstorming and early things and then like to write the rest. Some people like the complete opposite, where they like to do the thinking themselves and then might get the AI to write it. From a business context, I don't care as much, as opposed to one thing that I care about is there's a person who's responsible for the work at the end of the day and responsible for the quality of the work at the end of the day.
I mean, just to follow up on that, right? I guess there are quite, I guess, a few of backlash here and there, especially when it comes to like even universities, right? So there, if I'm not wrong, I saw that like they have tons of AI screening tools, basically stopping people from, I guess, writing. But I think to your point, it's almost like you're not really solving the problem because it's just a tool. People are going to use it one way or the other, however they want to use it. And then from a workplace perspective, I think it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts, right? How are you, I guess, screening your candidates on the AI's front, right? Do you actively encourage them to use more, or do you want them to think differently? And like you said, you want someone that's accountable for the outcome at the back of it. But how do you think about, I guess, improving the thinking around it, using the tools for specific type of activities? Like, it's just interested to hear, right? This is more about talent management as well, using the tool itself. I don't know, I'm just trying to think back, like maybe, date back to like the internet days. I think I'm not that old, unfortunately. By the time I come to workforce, internet is already available. But love to hear your thoughts, right? How do you think about, I guess, talent management from AI perspective, right? From using AI to deploying AI, etc.
We explicitly, so when we interview, we obviously give people take home tests and things like that. And I've heard some of my peers say they no longer give take home tests because they're like, well, they're just going to use AI to do it. And our perspective is, like, when we give the test, we say we want you to use AI and feel free to use it or not use it. We don't care. But in the next interview, you need to justify why you did every single thing the way you did it. And so we encourage people to use AI as part of their work. But we always have the balance of, you need to explain exactly why you decided to use this approach rather than this approach. And if you're not able to answer that, then that's an issue. And I think that's kind of, in our interview process, how we think about this balance of, we know AI is going to be hugely impactful, and if you're not using it in some regard, you're probably leaving like productivity on the table. So we want people to use it, but also at the same time, you still need to be accountable and you still need to have made the decisions and thought about the options rather than just hitting tab all the time. So that's the kind of balance that we try and strike.
I love it. It's almost like trying to test their thought process. It's right, really trying to explain why you're doing something and not the other. Interesting.
Well, because there's an argument that the actual process of coding is the thing that's somewhat being commoditized, like the actual writing of the code. And the thing that's difficult is the thought process thing. And so that's what we want to test for.
Meryem, why? So, how does your AI stack look like? Are there like tools that you resort to? So, how does your day to day look like, and how is AI influenced by it?
So mine is fairly simple. I use ChatGPT really extensively, premium version. And I also use Superhuman, which is how I do my inbox management and things. When it comes to like the company's stack, I don't think we have a stack yet. Every one in the company is given budget to be able to try and experiment with AI tools. And I think people have made different decisions as to what tools they think work best for them, for their particular use case and their particular workflows. So we're still very much in a period of experimentation. I've settled on ChatGPT because it kind of has so much background knowledge about me now. It's got so much memory about me now that it just makes the use of the tool really, really easy and simple. I used to use Claude a lot more, but I have kind of moved away from that and just been on ChatGPT mainly.
And maybe a follow-up question on this one. I mean, you were just sharing about your most surprising insights from last week around this whole OpenAI data saving, despite the fact that you even use the temporary chat. And I do think that is actually quite a big concern. Like, how do you look at it if you just said, okay, you use ChatGPT Premium, ChatGPT knows you really, really well, most likely also a lot of things for the company. How do you, like, what's your thought process on that one?
So I never, and no one in the company ever puts kind of client information in ChatGPT as a result of that. And like, that's kind of always been a rule. When it comes to corporate information, well, so as in like, for example, how we think about our positioning or value prop or whatever, these things change so quickly. So by the time it actually is legally discoverable, let's say, I don't know, in 2 years, so much would have changed that none of that would be relevant anymore. However, I can only say this because I am a startup, right? I can only say this because we can decide to take that risk because we think the productivity gain is high enough to justify the risk there. It's a very different conversation if you are, for example, an enterprise that maybe your institutional knowledge doesn't change as quickly, and things that you could put in today would still be relevant in a couple of years, will still be part of your secret sauce and all of these things. I used to use ChatGPT for everything. So like business all the way to like incredibly personal when I'm trying to think about how to have a difficult conversation with someone. I think I've used it slightly less for the personal stuff since realizing that, because I'm kind of like, I don't really necessarily want that kind of thing to be legally discoverable because, whatever. So that's kind of how I manage the risk. It's more of like just an informed risk position at this point, but always kind of never putting kind of client information in it, just from out of good practice.
I'm fascinated. So how, as a society, we trust so ChatGPT so much. So as you're saying, so here, in some cases, so people, so peers, they are telling me they are sharing so health information, maybe like some type of like mental problems. They're using ChatGPT as a psychologist, as a therapist, and so on. And so here you're mentioning how this data is used, right? So in the end, on one side, we're trusting all our so most inner personal stuff to ChatGPT, but we don't know in the background what is OpenAI doing with that, right? Plus, of course, all the company information, maybe trade secrets, whatnot. So we do not really know what is it that people are really doing. So here with AI, and so with that in mind, so here, Meryem, is there like a message that you have for our audience? Anything that you feel that either we didn't mention, we didn't cover, or you like to leave so the audience with?
Well, I think my key message since the beginning of this, what you call the ChatGPT revolution, has been to use it and integrate it into your workflows and just use it a lot, because that's the only way to figure out what the value and possibility is. Now, that's not to say that you need to take the same risk that I might be taking with using something like ChatGPT, where my messages won't be deleted, but maybe you, for example, deploy a local Hugging Face model or a local Llama model and start playing with these models, start playing with these applications, and really figure out the art of the possible. Because we're still in the stage where people haven't figured out necessarily the killer app for AI, especially in the enterprise. There's ChatGPT, which is great, but people are still not figuring out that killer app. And the only way we're going to figure that out is by having lots of eyeballs on this technology, trying lots and lots of different things.
Absolutely, definitely something that is so hands-on, trial by error, and so on. And just a final thing, where can people find you online? And also, if they hear this and say, hey, Doubleword, and hey, we've been thinking in our company how we can maybe like onshore all these AI technologies, how we can host it locally, how can they get started?
So I'm most active on my LinkedIn. So feel free to reach out to me whenever you want on my LinkedIn. My name's Meryem Arik. And then you can also check out our website, doubleword.ai. And we are always very happy to chat and give demos and see if it's relevant for your use case. As I was saying to Chris earlier, our sales cycles tend to be really consultative, where we work with our clients to figure out if they actually need our product at all. And if they do need something like our product, what are the things that are going to be most important to them? So yeah, feel free to reach out whenever.
Fantastic. And I'm sure that after this fascinating discussion, there may be some outreach people who are curious and say, hey, how can I get started? So that is basically everything for today, right? So we could sit here and talk hours and hours and hours with you, Meryem. But in the end of the day, we have to go ahead and then work on the AI revolution. And therefore, thank you everyone for being here, and stay tuned for a next show of the ChrisRodMax Show. Until next time, see you next week.